Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar on the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Kuhl, and I'm the head of strategic initiatives and projects at the Weston Family Foundation, and I also am intimately involved with the conduct of this initiative. Um, Before I dive into some of the details and the challenge and get into the content of this webinar, I just want to let you know that firstly, this webinar is being conducted both in English and in French. I also want to let you know that a lot of the information, in fact, most of the information that we'll be covering in this webinar today is available on our website, which is www.homegrownchallenge.ca. If you have questions, you're always welcome to reach out to our team at challenge@westonfoundation.ca. But in addition to that, you're also entitled to ask questions during this webinar. And as we've done in the past, we'll make every effort to get to the bottom of the question list. So if you do have a question and you want to ask it during the webinar, please use the chat function in Teams to either create a question de novo or even to like someone else's question so we get a sense of priority. Note that there is also a Q&A function normally on this platform, but we've disabled that platform. So the only way that you'll be able to ask questions during this webinar is by entering them into that chat box. So the objective of the webinar today is really to focus in on the shepherd phase of the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. The deadline for applications to this shepherd phase is December 20th, 2022. So it's about a month out, and this is a very important deadline because it really is the last opportunity to get into the Homegrown Innovation Challenge, as I'll explain in just a moment. So we'll really dive deep into the requirements for the shepherd phase. We won't cover the scaling phase in as much detail. Even within the shepherd phase, we'll cover different topics with varying levels of intensity. So if you feel like we've glossed over something that you're interested in, or if you feel like we really haven't covered something that you think is important, particularly in the run-up to the December 20th deadline, again, please go ahead and put that question in the chat box, and we'll return to those topics as necessary at the end of the presentation today. So I'll start off, as I always do, by reviewing the all-important challenge statement for the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. And that is, the Homegrown Innovation Challenge asks innovators to create and deliver a market-ready system to reliably, sustainably, and competitively produce berries out of season and at scale in Canada. As you'll see, we're very flexible on how innovators can achieve this goal. All we care about is that someone achieves this by the end of the challenge, and that is around 2028, certainly not by the end of the shepherd phase, as we'll discuss. We're seeking a system that is ready to go commercially and at scale into the market around 2028. We're looking for reliability. We're looking for something that's environmentally sustainable. And we're also looking for something that is competitive, and that is ideally you can produce berries and ultimately other fruits and vegetables at the same cost and ultimately at a similar selling price to competitors, particularly those in other countries. That's ultimately what we're trying to achieve. Of course, the impact we're seeking, the most important outcome we're seeking in this initiative is to make Canada more independent for fruits and vegetables, and that means producing more, extending the growing season, and doing it at a much reduced cost, so that we can achieve that level of competitiveness with foreign producers. As noted, the Shepherd phase is the second phase of this challenge, and the deadline is December 20th, 2022. Of course, there was an initial phase in the three-phase challenge, which was the Spark phase. That deadline has already passed, and we've already deployed 15 grants of approximately $50,000 to 15 teams in Canada. Of course, the use of Spark funding was really to facilitate and support team building, conceptualization. We really think of in many ways, of the challenge starting during the Shepherd phase. So the Shepherd phase will see up to $1 million granted to up to 10 teams. And that is meant to support proof of concept, small scale proof of concept worked on your growing system for up to 18 months. Okay. At the end of that 18-month interval, we will reassess the progress made by each of the teams and get a sense of the potential of the technology, and then take the top 4 from among those 10 teams that receive Shepherd funding and provide up to $5 million each to those teams to facilitate the scaling of those innovations such that they are ready for commercial use and the commercial production of berries and ultimately other fruits and vegetables. Once again, if you do not receive Shepherd funding, you cannot receive scaling funding, nor can you receive the 2 $1 million awards that are available at the end of the initiative. For more information on those awards, as well as on the scaling phase, please check out our website at the URL I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. At this point, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Lucas Alexandrovich, who is the program manager in charge of the Homegrown Innovation Challenge, to come in. And he's going to walk you through a little bit of the detail around the Shepherd phase application form and give you a sense of what we're expecting, at the level of detail to provide that kind of thing. So, Lucas, I'm going to hand it over to you at this point.
Great. Thanks very much, Jeff. So to start, I'll explain about how you apply and how you get started. So we're accepting applications in both English and French, and that will delineate a little bit on how you submit your proposal. So for English language proposals, the way to apply is through Smart Simple, which is our online submission portal. The link is provided here. It's also on our website, but it's a very easy to use system. And if you're using it for the first time, you'll have to create an account. And after that, you should have access to our online application, the Shepherd application, within the menu in Smart Simple. For French language applications, somewhat similar. We're going to be asking you to basically send in a Word document that follows the format of the sample application form that we have posted on our French website. And we will take that and manually upload it to our online system. Despite the sort of different routes for submission for the different language applications, after submission, both languages are treated the same in the next review and assessment steps. Next slide, please. So just to give an overview of the proposal, it's made up of a number of different sections. Most of these are relatively self-explanatory and brief. So we ask about the team members. We ask you to describe, who you are as a lead collaborator, as well as your co-applicants and collaborators. We ask a little bit about demographic information about the team. The due diligence section then gets into a bit more detail on non-qualified donee partners, so any industry partners, and some additional information about them. The your solution section is probably the biggest lift in the application. That's really the meat of, what does your solution look like? What does it entail? And I'll get into a bit more detail about that. We have an impact reporting section where we just ask a bit more background about your team and the experience of your team. and kind of, whether you've been working together for a while, whether you've applied to other challenge prizes before, your experience in ag tech or agriculture versus other disciplines, just to get a bit more sense of who are the interested applicants applying to this challenge. And then we ask about milestones for the project. So how will you basically organize the Shepherd Award, what's going to be done, and when the funding is going to be received. We ask you to fill out a budget section, which of course describes under major budget headings what you're going to be requesting and why. And a final section asking for a signature from all partners on the proposal. The French language application follows a very similar format. Some of the sections are just condensed just because it's a slightly different format, but all the same information is in both language applications. Next slide, please. And just to flag in particular for two sections, I mean, for the whole application, you'll be working across your team, but for two sections in particular, we're going to be asking you to specifically reach out to all members of your team to get a bit more information from them. The first one is the demographic information survey. As I mentioned, as a foundation, we just want to understand a little bit better who our community is and the diversity of applicants that are applying for our funding. And a survey will be emailed to each of the team members that are listed on your application. So this will be proactively prompted. The survey is optional, of course, but we hope to encourage you and the team to fill it in for us. And of course, whether you complete it or not, that will have no impact on the assessment of your proposal. The other bit is the due diligence section, where, as I mentioned, this is where we require a little bit more information for industry partners, so businesses, and just a bit more details about the business, sort of their number of employees, where they're based, etc. So we're going to be asking you to reach out to any partners on your team that are industry partners to make sure that they fill out that questionnaire that's part of the proposal. At this point in time, during submission, we're actually not asking too much information about it. It's mostly basics about name of the business, number of employees, that kind of thing. But just to note that if your team does receive an award, we can come back and just get a bit and request a bit more information about the businesses that are part of your proposal, just to conduct some more internal due diligence. We don't want to ask it up front, just not take too much of your time in the near term, but we can come back and request that information if you do receive an award from us. Next slide, please. So overall, the application, the information you submit will be reviewed and assessed according to 5 criteria, which are listed here. They're also on our website. The first one is impact, and this really assesses the alignment of your idea with the overall challenge statement. So that goal of extending the growing season, making sure that the solution is sustainable, it's affordable and competitive and reliable. To what degree is your proposal aligning with all of those metrics? The second is technological achievement. So better understanding how novel is the technology, what gaps does it fill, and how does it compare to the wider market? Thirdly, we'll be looking at the team and how capable, how well-rounded is the team, and are they able to deliver on implementing the solution you propose. The fourth criteria is commercial viability. There we ask for a bit more details on various end users and kind of stakeholders down that pipeline, and how the solution aligns with them. So thinking about farmers, retailers, consumers, and through their kind of unique perspectives, how would they interact with your solution? Would it be fit for purpose and kind of agreeable and make sense with those end users? And lastly, of course, we ask about environmental sustainability, and to what degree does your solution and this growing method compare to current growing practices? Is it better? Is it worse? Ideally, it's better. And we ask you to describe the risks and drawbacks in an environmental basis from your solution. Next slide, please. And in this slide and the next slide, I wanted to point out two specific kind of more substantial sections that we have in the proposal. And these are two areas where we ask in each for a maximum 4-page upload that describes your overall plan for implementing and trialing your technology, as well as a plan for scaling your solution and technology over the course of the challenge. So the first of these 4-page uploads is your technical plan. So this really gives us a sense of, what you're going to be doing over the course of the challenge with that year and a half, with that $1 million to execute on your technology. And there's 4 criteria within that. We ask about feasibility, so better understanding how the different components of your solution work together, and how the solution delivers on that challenge statement of extending the growing season. We ask about stage of development, so better understanding, what's already been, what components of your solution have already been innovated on, where has work already been done, which TRL level are your different components at, if there's any pre-existing IP already, and essentially what still needs to be developed, what are your innovation goals, and what are you going to be doing over that year and a half. We ask about the specific activities over the shepherd phase. So this is the plan for the shepherd phase. What are the specific milestones and deliverables over that timeline? And how will this get you ready for the next phase of the challenge, which is the scaling phase, where teams get $5 million. And lastly, we ask you to outline any risks and mitigation strategies for those risks. So if you do have a high risk approach, which my colleague Jeff will talk a little bit about, which we do welcome, just that it's balanced with kind of, if you can foresee the challenges and explain a little bit about how you will get around them and how you will overcome those obstacles. Next slide, please. And the next of these more substantial sections, another 4-page upload, would be more on the scaling approach. So over the course of the challenge, we're going to understand a little bit more about how you're going to trial and develop the technology. But then in this section, what are you going to be doing to make sure that it can, at the end of the program, benefit as many Canadians as possible? So in this section, we'll be asking a little bit about your cost structure. So given your capital expenditures, operating expenditures, what do those inputs look like, and what is the resulting cost or estimated cost at this point of the fruit coming out of your system? And how would this compare, to different products on the market and in different markets across the country? We'll ask about competitors to better understand who else is doing something similar out there and what your key advantage and value add is. We'll ask about your implementation plan. So similarly as in the last section, what are you going to be doing in this phase of the challenge, over the shepherd phase, over that year and a half, and more broadly, your plan over the scaling phase, if you get to that point, to make sure that your technology is ready to be scaled up, getting into the hands of end users, and being utilized for the benefit of Canadians. And lastly, similarly, we're going to ask about risks, any risks you foresee in that scaling and that kind of business development domain, and any mitigation measures that you are planning. And within this too, we ask specifically about if you are conducting any consultations, survey, focus surveys, etc., with these end users that I mentioned. So whether it be growers, retailers, consumers, and how would they perceive your solution? Yeah. Next slide, please. And lastly, I also want to talk about the budget section, which is relatively important for us to assess as well. So overall, we're going to be asking for the budget to be split into a minimum of 2 tranches, which are each tied to the milestones that you set out in your project plan. Though the tranches do not necessarily have to be 50-50 splits. You can set the ratio at whatever makes most sense for your project and for your collaborators and what you need. In terms of allowed costs, we're relatively flexible on the use of the award. The only restriction we have is on supporting capital expenditures. So, for example, construction of buildings, acquisition of land for collaborators who are not qualified donees. So for any industry partners, we would not be supporting, for example, their purchase of land or buildings, though we would support these costs for qualified donees. So for the leads, such as universities, colleges, registered charities, and the like. There's a small asterisk there, and that really refers to the caveat that if any industry partners on your team do require the purchase or acquisition of equipment that's more substantial and that's relatively critical to the implementation of that project, then we can assess that on a case-by-case basis. Our overheads are capped at 10%. And this is within the overall figure of the overall kind of budget limit of 1 million. So for example, you can't request $1 million in different budget items and then add 10% on top of that. It would have to be contained within that $1 million budget cap. And while we don't require matched or leveraged funding from industry partners the way that other funding programs, for example, from government require, we do encourage it, and it would be deemed probably beneficial to strengthen the application if there is some in-kind support, in-kind contributions, or cash or funding from across the collaborators on your team. And just to note too that the tranches that we are asking your budget to be split into, that only refers to the overall budget. So for example, telling us that you would require, 3 million upfront and 300,000 upfront and 700,000 for a second tranche. Just to say that doesn't need to be split by the individual budget categories that we have in that section. So for example, by personnel, by consumables, by other materials, it's just referring to the overall absolute number. How is that split across different tranches? I see the slides have disappeared.
Yeah, I was just gonna jump back in.
Oh, okay.
Lucas, thank you very much. I will continue just with some really more administrative aspects of the challenge. But just before I jump into there, I just wanted to remind people that if you do have questions, maybe it's about how to access the application form, maybe it's about the sections of the application form, or what to include in your four-page operating plan or your four-page implementation plan, please pop those questions into the chat box, and we'll get to them shortly. I think what we've found, and I'm sure Lucas, you will agree, that in past webinars, really, I think much of the value for participants derives from the Q&A session as opposed to our presentation, because what we're really seeking to do is provide information that maybe doesn't come through clearly on the website, or that is subject to some interpretation. So please do take advantage of that. Our colleague Emma is busily curating those questions, and we'll be reading out some of those questions shortly. Okay, I will continue. And I've just got a few more slides before we jump back into jump into that Q&A session. I did want to take a moment and talk about three things we get a lot of questions about. The first is, how exactly do we review and adjudicate these applications once we receive them? Well, the answer is it's really a two-stage process, in a manner of speaking. The first stage involves the use of independent expert reviewers that we recruit from around the world. They may be experts in open field farming, they may be experts in energy solutions for controlled environment, they may be experts in plant genetics, et cetera, et cetera. And we will aim to have at least 3 independent reviewers review each and every Shepherd application that we receive. Their scores and their comments then are forwarded to our judging panel, which is represented on the slide I have open in front of you right now. And as in the Spark phase, we have an international judging panel of 7 individuals. This is chaired by Mr. Dominic Barton. And each of the judges brings a certain expertise to the challenge, and they ultimately make the decisions about how who should receive our grants and who should not. So what you may notice is that Lucas and I are not on the list of reviewers or on, as judges, and I think that's important because we don't have any decision-making authority here. And the reason I think that's important is we're here to help you. It's actually in our best interest and it's our goal to make sure as many great applications get in front of the reviewers and the judges as possible by December 20th. So after this call, if you have some questions, if you want to discuss a concept, if you need some help team building, please don't hesitate to reach out. The email address that comes to us all is challenge@westonfoundation.ca. The second topic area in which we get a lot of questions is around intellectual property. So we thought we'd add a slide to speak to this directly. And I think the first, and in many ways the most important statement, is the first bullet point, that the Weston Family Foundation does not take any interest into any intellectual property created through participation in the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. Like all of the other activities of the Weston Family Foundation, this is a charitable grant. There's no expectation of any return on investment. There's no expectation of any preferred access to the technology that results from the funding. So this is a pure grant. We really leave it up to the innovation team, the qualified donee, the collaborators, the co-applicants to decide to whom that intellectual property is assigned, who holds the commercialization rights, etc. The one thing I would say is that we do expect that lead applicant, the qualified donee, I'll come back to this concept in a moment, to make inventive contributions to the intellectual property. What we don't want to see is applications coming in from qualified donees of convenience or shell qualified donees, so to speak. That is really not the idea. We do expect that qualified donee to make a material contribution to the project and play an important and lead role in the innovation process. The only requirement that we have around commercialization intellectual property is around putting Canada first. So in our grant agreement, we do include a provision whereby if we feel that an entity who holds the commercialization rights to IP that emanates from the Homegrown Innovation Challenge is not promptly commercializing the food product of that technology in Canada, we can cause the licensor to terminate the license and grant that license, the Canadian license, to another entity who will serve the interests of the Canadian public. I think this is generally understandable. Our mission as a foundation is around the well-being of Canadians, so we do want to make sure that Canadians benefit promptly from the technology and ultimately food product that is created through our funding. So just to be sure, if you wish to have a collaborator, which is a for-profit company from another country involved in your innovation team, that is fine. If your collaborator, whether they're based in Canada or based abroad, if they wish to commercialize this technology in other countries, they are welcome to do so without limitation. Our only requirement, again, is that Canadian consumers are addressed promptly, and that these berries and ultimately other fruits and vegetables are made available to Canadians as quickly as possible. I know that's a little bit convoluted, so if you do have questions, or if this is something important to you and something where you require precision, don't hesitate to either throw a question in the chat box or reach out to us to discuss further. I've mentioned a couple times this concept of qualified donees, and I think this is another area where we get a lot of questions. We are required as a Canadian private foundation, we're regulated by the Canada Revenue Agency, and we are required by law to give all grants to qualified donees as this phrase is defined by the Canada Revenue Agency. You can go on the Canada Revenue Agency website and look up the definition of a qualified donees, but for the purpose of this, of our discussion today, I'll define them broadly as academic institutions, registered charities, municipalities, and government entities. Um, if it's a not-for-profit entity, it could be a qualified donee to the extent that it's a registered charity. If in doubt, there's also a very helpful search engine on the CRA website where you can enter in the name of the entity and see if it is indeed a registered charity. There has been some discussion at the level of federal government about expanding the definition of qualified donees to include not-for-profit organizations that are not registered charities, but this change has not yet taken effect. So if it's a not-for-profit but not a registered charity, unfortunately, that would not count as a qualified donee for our purposes. The Weston Family Foundation can only provide grants directly to qualified donees, but that doesn't prevent qualified donees from partnering with other not-for-profit entities or for-profit entities and even procuring goods and services as long as it's done at fair market value, at fair market rates, excuse me. So we don't prohibit transfer of those funds to the extent to commercial entities, provided it's really for around the procurement of goods and services. To be sure, we very much encourage the formation of multidisciplinary innovation teams. We really like to see tech companies involved and farmers and controlled environment producers and research institutes. Ultimately, we think that the team that will prevail in this challenge will have a lot of different skill sets represented among its ranks. And once again, you can have one qualified donee, you can have more than one qualified donee, but you can't have zero. There needs to be a qualified donee leading each and every innovation team. Lucas spoke to the concept of cash and in-kind contributions from either for-profit collaborators, co-applicants, et cetera. Again, it's not a matter of requirement. We don't require that, but that's very different from competitiveness. And the judges will give credit to innovation teams where we are seeing in-kind or cash contributions coming from, particularly from for-profit collaborators participating in the innovation team. Second last slide before we get into the Q&A. Over the last few months, the team at the Weston Family Foundation has received a lot of different questions and comments from different groups, and we've talked a lot with reviewers and judges. And we've kind of put together a list of 4 tips that we think are kind of bottom line messages in this webinar and things to maybe take into account, maybe that are not explicitly clear on the website. The first is something that Lucas alluded to a few minutes ago, and that is that we're very much seeking transformative solutions and do not at all fear risk. We like risky ideas. We like crazy ideas, provided there is some probability that it will ultimately become an innovation that actually achieves our goals as set out in the challenge statement. So don't worry too much about whether your innovation, your plan would be perceived as too risky. You need to articulate your risk mitigation plan, but that's not something we're particularly worried about at the Weston Family Foundation. We're very much open. This challenge is about extending the growing season. It's not about growing berries all year long. And all of that to say, we welcome submissions from both those employing open field solutions as well as those using controlled environment solutions. If it is around controlled environment, please do bear in mind that we think that solutions that will ultimately prevail in this challenge will very seriously consider energy generation and use. We think that's one of the major problems with controlled environment growing right now, and we want to see that addressed so that we can reduce the costs associated with production and therefore deliver those savings to the customer in the form of price parity. So please do not overlook the importance of energy generation. One point that I might add as really more of a tip to be, is again, we're looking for complete solutions. You can't prevail in this challenge if you don't have a complete solution from soup to nuts that will address our challenge statement. You need to be able to convince the judges that all of the necessary components to produce to come up with a growing system that can reduce cost and be sustainable and scalable, et cetera, they all need to be part of your application and part of your project. So again, it must be a complete solution. As I mentioned before, we're looking to really start addressing Canada's food sovereignty issue at the end of the challenge. We're looking to start moving that needle toward domestic production and away from foreign imports as early as 2028, 2029. Again, we don't expect that to happen at the end of the shepherd phase, but we do expect it to start to happen around the end of the 3-year scaling phase. So your plan should present a roadmap for how are you going to get this to a position in 2028, 2029, that time frame where you can start to produce berries at a commercial scale in a way that addresses all of the elements of the challenge statement. And lastly, again, this addresses the question, why berries, which we get a lot. And of course, berries are but a means to an end. Our thinking is that if you can address the challenge statement for berries, you'll be able to address it for a number of different fruits and vegetables. And indeed, the reviewers and the judges will be looking very closely at the transferability of your solution to other fruits and vegetables. You don't need to demonstrate it. You only need to demonstrate it for a minimum one berry crop. But you need to be able to extrapolate and tell us what other fruits and vegetables it is transferable to and why, if only conceptual. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to invite my colleague Emma Carey, who's been monitoring the chat box, to start giving us some of your questions. And of course, again, there's plenty of time. We'll start going through the questions, hopefully the ones that have been prioritized. But as we go through this Q&A session, please continue to add questions to the chat box. And we'll really endeavor to stick around until we get through all of those questions. So over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Jeff. So the first question we have is a pretty common one. And it's, if people haven't submitted an application at the Spark phase, the first round, are you still able to submit an application for the Shepherd phase?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something I kind of glossed over at the beginning of the presentation. So Spark funding is optional. You do not require Spark funding to submit a Shepherd application. And in many cases, our judges and our reviewers won't even know if an applicant receives Spark funding or not. So not a requirement, not even necessarily an advantage to an applicant. But of course, as I mentioned, Shepherd funding is required to advance to latter stages of the challenge.
Great, thanks, Jeff. We've also had a couple people in the chat kind of detail their company and what that company does, as well as putting some emails in the chat. So feel free to reach out to them if those hit a gap in your application or if you're interested in discussing more with them. Our next question is there a page limit for the individual CVs/resumes?
I'll take that one. Yes, there is. We are asking you to limit it to 5 pages per CV, and there's no cap on the number of partners you can have on your team, but we're asking you to submit only CVs for up to 10 team members, so kind of the most significant relevant team members. So that's 10 CVs max across your team, and each CV up to 5 pages max.
And
And
what I just might,
that'll, I was
sorry,
just going to say,
Lucas.
that's all, that guidance is within Smart Simple in our electronic application, and those guidance notes are also in the French application form as well.
And then our next question here is it possible to get a mutual non-disclosure agreement signed prior to submission?
Yeah, we don't sign a non-disclosure agreements as part of this, a part of the application review process. We do include confidentiality provisions in the grant agreement at the time that we disperse funding, but it's not our practice to enter into non-disclosure agreements with any applicant in any program of the Weston Family Foundation.
To maybe alleviate any concerns, of course, all our reviewers and judges are bound to confidentiality. And we've had this question before too, because obviously an institution, a college or university is leading a team and has to, get information from other partners as part of that application. If there's any concerns about confidentiality there, for some of those documents, such as due diligence forms, you can send them directly to our foundation staff team, as opposed to through your lead investigator, if there's really anything kind of sensitive there. And we're happy to chat about that as well.
Thanks for those answers, Jeff and Lucas. So our next question here is, can you expand on the need for qualified donees to make inventive contributions to the IP?
Yeah. Gladly. I think really the point there is we do need the qualified donee. We need that qualified donee to play an important role in the project. We have seen situations where you have a for-profit entity that is interested in participating in the challenge. They have all of the components of the solution of the project in their company, and now they just need to find a flag of convenience that is a qualified donee that can receive the funding and then flow it on to the company who's really going to do the heavy lifting. That's not what this is about. And if we run into a situation where a qualified donee is merely a flow-through entity, such that an ineligible entity can receive the funding, we could get in serious trouble from the Canada Revenue Agency. So we do require that qualified donee not be a flow-through entity, that they incur many of the costs themselves, and ultimately, while it's not an absolute requirement that the qualified donee make an inventive contribution to any foreground intellectual property, I think the judges would look a little askance at an application that called for no inventive contribution from the qualified donee, because that would call into question whether they're really making any material contribution to the project itself. Okay, so again, really what that all comes down, and just to repeat what I said, is that the qualified donee cannot be there merely to flow funds to a for-profit entity. They need to play an important and even leading role in the project.
So Bianca had a bit of a follow-up to that question as well. So in the context of a QD being a government organization, does that still apply? And she's saying that they envisioned a bit of a different critical role for their qualified donee that didn't necessarily involve the IP creation.
Again, the IP creation is not a hard and fast requirement. I think at the end of the day, if you can convince the reviewers and the judges that the qualified donee will make a meaningful contribution to the project that does not result in an inventive contribution to intellectual property, then that's fine. But there does need to be a really critical role played by that qualified donee in any project that's funded under this challenge.
Thanks for that, Jeff. So this is sort of a similar question in terms of QD partners and collaborators. So someone's asking, to be clear, can some of the grant budget go to the non-QD partners for their activities, to be distributed to them by the QD applicant.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said earlier, qualified donees are the only entities that can directly receive funding from the Weston Family Foundation. But if they wish to turn around and use some of that funding to procure goods and services from businesses or other entities, they're entitled to do so as long as it's at fair market value. And there's no cap or ceiling on that either, as long as you can, as in your application, you can convince the reviewers and judges that that those transfers, all of the economic activity moves you toward achieving the challenge statement. And I think that's the same thing when we talk about using funds for capital expenditures, which is a little bit unusual for grant making organizations, even for the Weston Family Foundation. We allow it, but do bear in mind that you will need to convince the reviewers and judges that this will move you significantly toward achieving that challenge statement, as with any line item that you put in a budget.
And then we have a similar question here on that again. Is there a minimum amount of the donation that has to be directly spent by the QD compared to the collaborators?
Yeah, no, we don't define that.
Okay, moving on to a bit of a different topic here. For a nonprofit corporation looking at applying, is the best course for application to be partnering with an academic institution to be that QD?
Yeah. I mean, in essence, that's one route, but it is a requirement that you do require a qualified donee to lead the application, whether that's an academic institution or one of the other categories of qualified donees. There's several there, as Jeff mentioned, including municipalities, government entities. So many Indigenous communities themselves are qualified donees, and a whole roster of other registered charities that is required. On that note, this is a need that we see quite a bit from industry partners. A lot of industry partners are interested in the challenge and are looking for a qualified donee or a team to join. We do try to support some of that matchmaking. One of those platforms is our Circle networking platform that acts as sort of an online classifieds where people can post what they're offering, what services, equipment they're offering, or what needs they have within their team, and people can independently sort of go through those and post the messages themselves and carry on from there. I'll ask Emma if you wouldn't mind posting a link in the chat. And otherwise, we try to support that more manually. We're in touch with a lot of qualified donee teams as well and industry partners, and we try to match make where we can. So if Derek, if you can provide a bit more information on what you do and what you're looking for, we could try to send that information out through our channels as well.
Remember, don't hesitate to reach out, challenge@westonfoundation.ca.
So I've just posted that link in the chat to sign up for Circle. So do check it out. There are already people that have posted within that platform. So if there's any interesting people that you want to be linked up to, then feel free to reach out to them there. There have been quite a few more people introducing themselves, looking to network, which is great. In particular, there's a team looking for a grower, so do reach out to Yuxel Asli if you're interested in that. And there's a few other contact details in the chat as well. That is the end of our formal questions. So if you have any more questions you'd like to ask Jeff or Lucas, do put it in the chat now. This is sort of your last opportunity to ask them live, and this is your best opportunity to do so. So.
Just while folks consider if they have any additional questions, maybe I'll cover a few frequently asked questions. One of which is, how is this challenge connected to Loblaws? And the answer is it's not. there is no connection really at all. This is run independently by the Weston Family Foundation. Loblaws is not involved. Loblaws doesn't have any access to the technology. None of the information is shared with Loblaws employees. So this is completely independent. So there's no connection at all between our two organizations in this respect. We also get a question asked a lot about submitting in French versus English, whether there's an advantage really for one or the other, and the answer is absolutely not. If you you should submit your application in whatever language you're comfortable in. We are specifically, I think as Lucas mentioned, recruiting bilingual reviewers, expert reviewers. We have bilingual judges. So there won't be any problem on giving a very fair review to applications that are submitted in either of Canada's official languages. Another question we often get is where the innovation must take place. And as a matter of fact, we don't really require that the project work in the shepherd phase take place on the ground in Canada necessarily. We do have a requirement for the scaling phase, however, that all of those activities should be undertaken in Canada. Because obviously we're looking for technologies that are tuned, particularly at scale, to the Canadian environment. Speaking of which, we also get questions about people about whether a solution needs to be relevant for location, geographies across Canada, or whether it can just be relevant to a specific geography within Canada. And again, we don't have, again, the challenge statement is really the requirement and the set and speaks to the set of requirements. So we don't explicitly say that it must be relevant to all locations across Canada. But again, it comes back to the whole question of eligibility versus competitiveness. I think what we saw at the Spark phase, and indeed what we'll see, I expect to see in the Shepherd and moving forward in the scaling phase, is the applications, the projects that are most competitive and that ultimately prevail will be those that are relevant to a broad range of geographies and climates and ecosystems across Canada, and ideally even outside of Canada. So again, we don't require that broad relevance, but I think it would add to the competitiveness of the application if it is broadly relevant. I think I saw a few other questions pop in there, Emma, just while I was speaking.
Yeah, so we've had a few other questions. Someone's asked if there's a location on our website where we can see the contact info for those looking for partners. And Jeff, I might be more familiar with this than you, but in terms of that, the only place that you can really see that would be on Circle. The link for that is on our website under kind of the Apply Here section. It's also in the chat, but that's the only spot that you can really see that or be in contact with us because we are keeping a list. So challenge@westonfoundation.ca. Email us. We have a pretty large list going if you're interested in that.
Yep. Yeah, and one of the things we've been doing is actually tweeting out some of the different entities looking for partners and what they offer, what they're looking for. So I mean, to the extent that there's interest, we'll continue doing that. We also recently sent out an email, kind of a matchmaking email to our distribution list. So if you're interested in being a part of those communications, you can email us and give us your information. And please indicate up front, just to save time, if you're okay with us using your name and contact information in that communication, because otherwise we like to make sure that that's okay. Otherwise we'll send it in a de-identified fashion. So we'll continue to blast those out, but bearing in mind there's only been a month to put together these applications, so time is getting a little bit short. If you do want to request our assistance with matchmaking, it's probably best to get in touch pretty fast.
Our next question here is, can you expand on the expectations around IP ownership and exploitation?
Yep. So we don't, so we, even though we only fund qualified donees, that's not to say that we require the intellectual property to be assigned, whether that's ownership or commercialization rights to the qualified donee. We leave it up to the innovation team. So theoretically, you could have intellectual property that's jointly owned by the qualified donee and other partners, but the exclusive commercialization rights go to the for-profit collaborator, and we have no problem with that. The collaborator can be Canadian, the collaborator can be foreign. We really don't care. So you decide. It's really up to the innovation teams to work out how that intellectual property is divvied up. We don't obviously take any share. We have no interest in intellectual property. The one requirement that we have is that when it comes time to start selling the berries that are produced by your system or other fruits and vegetables that are produced by your system, you must put Canadians first, or otherwise put, you must promptly address the Canadian market and the Canadian consumers. Sometimes there's confusion about this. I'm not talking about the technology. There's no preference for Canadian entities as licensees of the technology, for example. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the food product that results from the technology that the Weston Family Foundation has supported. We want Canadians to have access to those berries promptly, because of course this challenge is about building Canada's food independence and sovereignty such that we are less reliant on imports.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Our next question here is, can the equipment that is being used, is it required to be purchased or rented or leased? Does it make a difference?
Yeah, we don't have any specific restrictions on that. It's really up to the team to decide. I guess the sort of overbearing guidance there was just to consider how you can best make use of that budget and how much value you can extract out of it. So some of those decisions on whether you're kind of buying it or purchasing it might sort of weigh in on the opportunity cost for having budget left over for, other activities in there. That's really up to the team to decide.
Great, thanks, Lucas. Our last question here that we have is, are the groups that are going to be selected for the Shepherd phase, will they be shared in a limited or a public way, or not at all?
Yeah, we do announce our grantees on our website, but that's really only with very general and non-confidential information. If you go on the website now, and I would recommend that you do, take a look at the information we posted on our 15 Spark grantees. Firstly, this will give you a good sense of the type of information we share on the website and beyond. But it'll also give you a sense of what some projects that have already been approved for funding look like and what the scope is and who's involved. It may give you a few ideas for your own project as you put it together for the Shepherd phase. But yes, we do reserve the right to communicate very basic information publicly about grantees and their partners. I see that Emma's been so kind as to post the link both the English language and the French language website for where you can find those short synopses of the Spark projects. Indeed, I mean, we do find that in a lot of cases, we're getting questions from folks who clearly haven't gone through the materials and the information on the website. I strongly recommend that you do that. There's a lot of information there that I think is really important to understand before you put pen to paper and start drafting an application. So please, if you're serious about applying, if you're serious about being competitive in this initiative, please do go through and check out the website, particularly the sections on terms and conditions, eligibility criteria, and around the judging criteria. All really, really important, I think, to the the assembly of any strong application.
All right, so we're out of questions here. Last chance for anyone to put one in.
Just while we're waiting on that, giving people a last opportunity to put questions in, I might just speak to timelines very briefly. So applications are due December 20th. We do have, so the review by independent experts will be conducted during the first quarter of 2023. We have our judges come together in person in Toronto in March to consider those reviews, to discuss the applications. That session may well also involve live interviews of Shepherd applicants. So you do need to make sure you're available for that in the event that you are invited to a live interview session. And following that meeting, we expect that we will be notifying successful grantees, successful applicants in April of 2023, with funds to pay out in the weeks and months to follow. Of course, after we notify you of your success, then we enter into a contracting phase where we will put in place a grant agreement with all standard provisions around use of proceeds, confidentiality, reporting requirements, etc. And once that's executed, then we're in a position to wire the first tranche of the funding out to you. Okay, so we're really looking at a spring kickoff for Shepherd phase, and once again, it's an 18-month phase leading into the scaling application. As I said at the beginning of the call on it, because I think this is really important to understand, is that you must receive Shepherd funding to apply to the scaling phase. And we're giving out 4 grants of $5 million each. So that's 20 million total in the scaling phase. So if you successfully receive Shepherd funding, you have also a 40% chance of receiving that scaling award of up to $5 million. We're not letting others into the application, into the initiative after the Shepherd phase. Anything else, Emma?
Someone's put a comment in about kind of agriculture and Canada's emissions reduction plan vis-a-vis climate change, but no real questions left.
Okay. Well, again, if you haven't had an opportunity to articulate a question in the chat box, if really something comes to mind after we wrap up the webinar today, you can always reach out to us by email, and we'll do our best to get back to you promptly. Again, we're always happy to chat, whether it's about matchmaking or something else, or addressing your questions about eligibility, etc. One tip I might give you, maybe call it tip number 5, is that you're also entitled to speak to our judges. I don't think we mentioned this during the last webinar, but the way we've structured it is that we have contracted them and prepared their contracts such that they are able to speak with prospective applicants before their applications are submitted, and that doesn't result in an automatic conflict of interest or anything like that. We've specifically laid that out. So look at the judges. It may be well worth your effort and time to connect with one of the judges, have a conversation, run your ideas past them, get their feedback. If you do wish to take advantage of that opportunity, just reach out to us, tell us who you're looking to connect with, what you want to discuss, and we can help you make the arrangements with that judge. Again, we're very serious as a foundation about solving this issue around Canada's food sovereignty, and to achieve that, we want to make sure the best possible applications are put in by December 20th. So we'll do whatever we can as a team to try to achieve that goal. So, Lucas, any closing thoughts from you, or any closing tips?
No, just to reiterate, we're here to support. We do want the best quality applications. So if you have any questions, I'd encourage you to, rather than make any assumptions, do get in touch with us. As Jeff said, make sure you read all the eligibility guidelines. Yeah, best of luck.
Thank you. And Emma, are we, any other questions come in before we wrap up?
No, you're all good to wrap up.
Okay, great. Well, there, on behalf of the Homegrown Innovation Challenge team and indeed of the Weston Family Foundation, we'll just thank you for tuning in today and for all your great questions. We enjoy giving these webinars, and we're very excited to see what comes in on December 20th. And again, no idea is too risky for us. So if you've got crazy ideas, you know, we're looking for home runs, even at the expense of doubles and triples, so to speak. So give us your crazy transformative ideas. That's what we're looking for. We think that ultimately is how we're going to address these issues and bolster Canada's food sovereignty. Last thing I'll say just before I go is that on Friday morning, I believe I'll be appearing on a podcast called Ready, Set, Grow. If you didn't get enough information out of this, we'll be covering a lot of the same topics on Friday, so you can find that. I believe it's broadcast live as well as will be saved as a podcast, so you can access that as well. Okay. Thanks again, everybody, and good luck.